Hi, I'm Smitha. I just joined Meta recently, actually a few months ago, within the Exploratory AI Research Group, and I want to talk about some new work I've been working on. It's still very much work in progress, but some new stuff with fair colleagues, so excited to get all of your feedback on it. So I want to start by talking about, this recent wave in deliberative democracy theory. Recently, in the past few decades, theories of democracy have kind of moved from aggregative theories of democracy in which political legitimacy comes from, intermittent elections in which people vote, to more deliberative, focused theories in which kind of thoughtful discourse among the public is kind of the key thing that gives political legitimacy to democratic processes. And, even more recently, with this advent of online discussions, social media, news platforms, comment sections, you might think that these online discussions present some kind of opportunity to scale the kind of public sphere that you would want for a deliberative democracy. Potentially, you could talk to people that you usually don't speak to in real life, get access to more viewpoints, but in practice, what we actually see often is that online conversations devolve into toxicity and hostility. So how do we make comment sections online closer to deliberative ideals? Well, what are the kind of ideals of deliberative democracy? What do we require for a discussion to not just be a discussion, but come closer to a deliberation? I'm going to argue that, there's many kinds of ideals that people have talked about, but at minimum, almost all theories of deliberation include at least two ideals. One that is focused more on conversational norms, say around civility and respect, and the second that focuses on representation of diverse views. So for example, Fishkin and Luskin in a 2005 article talk about the need for conscientiousness. So this means that the participant should be willing to talk and listen with civility and respect, and also the need for comprehensiveness, that all points of views held by significant portions of the population should receive attention. Similarly, Bechtinger et al. In their review of kind of like how deliberative ideals have changed over the years mentioned that the idea of mutual respect, that hasn't really changed. It's central to all theories of deliberation. The ideas around equality have moved more towards equal opportunity of influence, which sort of implies that those with different views should have some opportunity to be heard. So I'm going to just kind of abstract these theories and say, in general, on the one hand, we have this need for conversational norms, like around civility and respect, but also this need for representation of diverse views. So how do we actually promote these ideals in online discussions? Well, increasingly, machine learning is used to enforce some of these conversational norms, so thank you to Emily for the talk earlier. So for example, very commonly now people use things like toxicity or civility classifiers, and as Emily talked about, increasingly these classifiers are moving from just removing the negative to also trying to promote the positive, so predicting things like compassion, reasoning, etc. And these are content-based classifiers. They just predict, based on the content of the comment, different attributes. There's also been these calls to build bridging-based ranking systems. So the idea here is that instead of what we're doing right now, which tends to uprank content that is polarizing, could we actually uprank content that helps bridge diverse perspectives and connect divides? In practice, most implementations of bridging are based on a certain objective known as diverse approval, where basically you have your users, and then you kind of group them into different clusters. These could be predefined, but usually they're learned from the data, and they usually kind of correspond to political groups, vaguely from the data. What diverse approval does is it tries to uprank content that is approved across these diverse groups who normally disagree with each other. Diverse approval has been used in many high-impact applications. So for example, it's been used as one feature taken into account for comment ranking on Facebook. It's used in crowdsourced fact checks in the Community Notes program on X. And it's also been used for comment selection in collective response systems like Polis and Remesh. And because diverse approval has been found to select comments that are more civil, I'm going to say this is another kind of way that machine learning is being used to promote conversational norms. There's other effects of bridging, but this is one of the core effects. Okay, so increasingly, we have this trend of machine learning being used to promote conversational norms like civility and respect, but what about the other one? What about representation of diverse views? There's much less research on how to do this when we're ranking. And in fact, solely focusing on conversational norms might actually end up underrepresenting certain groups. So for example, when we use classifiers of comments, classifying comments for being civil or toxic or so on, it's, scholars have pointed out that there may be many cases where groups express legitimate anger at oppression. And so a civility classifier might filter out, for example, some of these comments. More generally, civility might not mean the same thing across all groups. And this has also been exemplified in some of the research that's found that toxicity classifiers tend to misclassify African American English as toxic and also misclassify statements, for example, statements containing words like gay as being toxic just because in the data set that's often used as slurs, even though obviously it doesn't always have to be a slur, a comment that uses the word gay. So this is kind of older research, and I'm sure people can tell you to what extent the newer toxicity classifiers still have this problem, but the point is just because of the quirks of machine learning, you wouldn't want to lose representation of groups. Similarly, bridging in the form of diverse approval could also underrepresent groups in the sense that when you focus on bridging across certain groups, you might underrepresent others. So for example, when the groups here are political groups, you might result in lots of moderate comments at the top of the ranking, but not representing views that are as ideological. So in our work, we're really trying to bring together both of these ideals when doing comment ranking. So our contributions here are we formalize a framework for thinking about optimizing conversational norms while also ensuring representation, where we leverage kind of ideas from representation that come from the social choice literature. Second, we're going to analyze trade-offs between both of these ideals, and we also provide algorithms for actually doing these optimizations. I'm just going to talk about the first two briefly today. So let's first talk about what is our framework for actually looking at both of these things. Okay, so our problem setting is that we have n users. Also, I apologize in advance. I'm going to have more equations than have been shown before, but we have n users on a platform who write and like m comments. So these are just all the comments that are on the platform. And the platform's problem is they need to select a subset to highlight. So for example, these could be the comments on the first page that receive the most attention. So the platform has to, as I said, pick some subset of all the comments that they to highlight. They're going to measure conversational norms through some function that ranks like, for example, how civil is this set of comments? And that's basically, it could be done by the content-based classifiers, like in the Perspective API, could be done in diverse approval, could also include aspects of engagement. But in general, we're going to abstract this away from now and say, the platform has some function f that they do this with. In the default approach, you might just pick these items to maximize f, the conversational norms, but the platform also wants to ensure representation. So how do we bring representation into the picture here? In our framework, we're actually going to borrow notions of representation from the social choice literature. So the discipline of social choice is focused on things like voting rules and elections, which voting rules have different properties. And in the past decade, there's been a lot of interesting work, not just on elections where you're picking one person, like you're electing one president, but where you're electing multiple winners. So for example, you're electing candidates to a committee. And we're going to actually leverage the ideas from representation in that literature and bring them back to the social media setting. So in particular, that setting actually looks very similar to this one, in that instead of the users, you have N voters, and they're going to vote on M candidates. From those M candidates, the election has to pick a subset of them, K representatives, for a committee. So, one thing you could do is you just pick the top representatives who get the most approval across all the voters, but actually this leads into a kind of tyranny of the majority sort of problem. And so work in social choice is focused on how do we give more representation to all groups when we can pick multiple winners. So in this setting, we think of the votes as being approval votes, meaning that people vote on each candidate saying yes or no, I approve of this candidate or not. It's not a ranking, it's just a yes-no. And kind of intuitively, if you can pick K representatives, intuitively each representative should represent N over K voters. And so we think of groups that are at least size N over K as deserving some representation. But not all groups, it doesn't make sense to group all users together all sets of N over K users together. We want to group together users that kind of are similar in their preferences. So in this axiomatization, we're going to call a group of voters cohesive if they can approve of at least one candidate in common. So they have one candidate that they all approve of. That means the group is cohesive. What this kind of representation theorem from social choice requires is that any cohesive group that's of size at least N over K, must have at least one member, at least one voter in that group approve of at least one of the chosen representatives. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but basically the idea is cohesive is that we're going to define these groups kind of bottom up from who they approve of. So if these groups, if people approve of similar candidates, we consider that to be a group that's cohesive, and if that's large enough, they deserve representation, at least some form of minimal representation. You might think this is pretty minimal because only one member in the group has to approve of one of the chosen representatives, but the strength of this kind of axiom comes from the fact that you're considering all of these groups, and you're going to ensure this to all of these groups. So we don't need to predefine them from demographics or anything. This is really just like a bottom-up representation from the data. When we return to the comment voting setting, it's basically exactly the same thing, except you have these groups of users. You say they're cohesive if they can approve of one comment in common, and you do the same kind of representation. A difference is we don't observe their approval on all comments. Instead, we'll observe the things that they like, the things that they upvote, and we're going to use that in place of direct kind of approval votes. So we'll have to do some learning of this matrix, but we can still ensure the same kinds of representation. So our final kind of problem that we can say for the platform is you want to pick kind of a set of comments that maximizes alignment with conversational norms while still ensuring this representation guarantee. So again, the conversational norms are measured through some function, f, and now we're going to kind of maximize this function f, but subject to the constraint that the set of comments we pick has to satisfy this justified representation guarantee. So that's the framework, and the first thing we kind of do is analyze trade-offs between these ideals. So the first thing you might ask is, what is the price of representation? Now that we are constraining ourselves to only pick comments that ensure this kind of representation quality, is it the case that we suddenly need to allow much more toxicity in order to have representation, for example? So we'll kind of skip over this a little bit, but basically we kind of look at what we call a price of justified representation. How well could you optimize those conversational norms if you weren't constrained to being representative versus how well can you do that if you are constrained to being representative? And we're going to look at this for different kinds of functions. So if the platform was just like, selfish and just maximizing engagement, which is maybe the first thing you would start with, how does engagement conflict with ensuring representation? And then if we broaden it out to not just being about engagement, but about other kinds of sort of approval-based metrics like diverse approval or bridging, versus if we broaden up this kind of class of functions being completely general, for example, even being like content-based classifiers, which aren't tied to people's bottom-up preferences at all. They're kind of like top-down content changes. So this is like a very toy graph, but basically I want to give some intuition about this. You don't need to worry too much about the actual bars. It's that, as we kind of broaden out the class of functions that we look at, the price of representation can be really high in terms of what we lose in these conversational norms. And it's the highest when we go all the way to the setting of general content classifiers, because basically they're not tied to people's bottom-up preferences. They're like a top-down intervention, but our notion of representation, it's like based on people's votes, and it requires something bottom-up. And so this is kind of quite bad because it's not a good sell for adding in representation, right? Because this kind of makes you think, oh, like you might have a lot more toxicity if you add in representation. So the next thing we turn to is, are there natural conditions where this price of justified representation is low? And what we look at is, what about the case when users' opinions can be partitioned into a few polarized groups, which is very common. I'm not saying this necessarily needs to be political, but even if you're looking at comments on a sports article, there's a few polarized groups, right? And not only is it common, it's also the setting that you most want to do some of these interventions, like bridging. What we find is actually that the price of justified representation, it's kind of not too surprising, is very, very low if you have this kind of structure to user preferences. So there's no actual, nothing that you're losing really by adding in this representation constraint. So this is kind of nice in the sense that if the platform is just trying to optimize for engagement, they're not going to give up much by adding in representation when this is the case. If they are trying to do these kinds of pro-social interventions, like diverse approval or civility classifiers, representation isn't going to come at a cost to those other kinds of values. So just to summarize, in this work, we're trying to kind of bring together these ideals of representation and civility. Our contributions are, first coming up with a framework to actually do this in. We analyze the trade-offs between both of these ideals. Didn't talk about this, but we have algorithms to actually do this optimization. But our next step is like actually doing this empirical analysis. And we started doing some experiments around this, trying to understand how much are these trade-offs between representation and civility. But overall, our overarching goal in this line of research is to try to use algorithmic facilitation to bring online discussions closer to deliberative ideals. And our work really focused on just two of these, respect and representativeness. And obviously, we don't expect that comment sections suddenly become like citizens' assemblies or something. But using this as a North Star, I think, is a very fruitful approach to kind of guide work on algorithmic facilitation in this area. So with that, I will end. And I just want to say thank you very much to my collaborators, especially Manon Ravel, who this is in very close collaboration with. So thank you. OK, there's like 2 questions.
Nice framework. I'm wondering if you could say a word more about why you picked what seems like very much a worst case, at least one framework, as opposed to something that's more of an average case. In terms of your criterion?
Do you mean the justified representation?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so I'm not being familiar with that. Why that justified representation rather than a different one that's more averagey and less worst case?
You mean averagey over groups?
It tends to do more of a
actually
outcome on average for people as opposed to a don't leave any one person out.
Oh, I see, I see. Yes, so there are extensions of justified representation that do more. I think in this work we were interested in, so those extensions of justified representation that require more, like you're suggesting, are often more complex to satisfy, and in some settings they can't be satisfied. So this is why we start with basically everything builds on this axiom of representation. So we first want to analyze what does it cost even to provide this minimal amount of representation. And then I think that is like an area of extension we're interested in. If you try to do something more, how different is this? Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, really cool stuff. So I thought a lot about representation, and I guess my question is, why should we assume that representation full stop is something that we desire? Basically, for every case where you imagine the kind you were talking about, that seems really good. Like, oh, we have this minority group who doesn't have a voice, so we need to up-rank their representation. Well, you also have minority groups who are technically minorities, like, say, a Nazi. And so full stop representation, imagine a distribution of extremity, you'd have to include all of them. So isn't there some actually like a caveat to that, or do you just kind of take that as part of your, I guess I didn't fully follow the cost analysis, so is that just part of that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think a lot of that is taken care of by the fact that this representation, it only gives representation to large enough groups. So a lot of like the worst groups you're talking about are very fringe, and those groups wouldn't appear high in the ranking because they tend to score low on these other kinds of like conversational norms issues. In addition, there can always be a sort of pre-processing step. This doesn't like say that we can't do something like guardrails that are just like we're not allowing people to pass by this limit. But I think naturally the example you described wouldn't come up because the group still needs to be like large enough to be deserving of representation in this idea.
Yeah, I guess, and we can talk about this later,
Yeah.
understanding it, but I guess my understanding was if they, so when you have like very fringe groups, they tend to be small, but they're very coherent and aligned. And so they would probably score high on that metric of having like people they approved of, if I understood that.
Yeah. The metric is basically you have to be cohesive, but it's like based on this idea of proportionality. If you're picking like 10 comments and there's 100 people, then the group should be of size at least 100 over 10, and so it should contain at least 10 users. So that's the idea, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I'm Guy. I'm going to talk about a few projects under the umbrella of the value of belief data in online recommendation systems. This is joint work with some subset of these collaborators for each of these projects. Dwarka Kalavas at UCL, Daniel Kluver and Kong and Joseph Consen at University of Minnesota, and Sean Sikdar. Okay? Now, the basic motivation, again, given that I'm in a session titled Recommender Systems, I probably don't have to convince you that recommender systems are important. If you go to many different online platforms, these systems are quite prevalent. Probably one of the most prominent deployments of these systems is on, for instance, Netflix. You go on Netflix and they have a personalized set of movies that are tailored to your taste based on kind of the past history that you have. Okay. Now, if we think about kind of the recommendation system problem, there's kind of two components to it, right? The first is kind of, typically platforms have some kind of data available for this problem, but most of the work has kind of been on this algorithmic question of kind of like, given this consumption data, how can I predict the utility for unconsumed goods, right? So kind of the canonical case here is you have a set of users, you have a set of items, right? And this is kind of a toy example to kind of illustrate the main intuitions for algorithms people used before. Right, so you have Alice, Bob, and you have RC who hasn't consumed C and D, and you're trying to basically complete this matrix to understand, what would RC think if he watched C or if he watched D. Right now, if you stare at this, you probably say, well, RC and Alice have really similar preferences. They both watched A and B, and they both liked it, whereas Bob hated A and B. So probably, we should recommend C or D because Alice also liked D and not C. Okay? Now, this intuitively makes sense. It might be the case that, if RC watched both C and D, it would be the case that they liked D more. But you can ask the question of, people got really good at this prediction problem, right, of doing this matrix completion. Is this actually a useful recommendation? right? And so I'm going to take this approach, which is for those of you that are in marketing, kind of is similar to kind of how we think about advertising, right? You might we might ask the question, is this kind of incremental, right? May RC have already watched D, even if we recommended him or didn't recommend him, okay? Now, to answer this question, what do we need to understand? We need to understand, kind of given the choice problem, like what would RC do without a recommendation, with a different slate of recommendations, or being recommended D? Right, and the second question is, we can first kind of take the data set as given, right? We can say we're kind of constrained to this world where we see consumption data or ratings data, and ask the question of, can we actually figure out what RC would have done from this, right? And so through a couple of papers, we kind of took more of an economics approach to this and kind of sat down and said, well, if we really think about kind of decision making in these kind of environments, like one thing that will kind of pop up is that it's not just sufficient to understand kind of what has RC consumed in the past, but also kind of what does RC think about unconsumed items? Because this will tell us a lot about what he may do if we recommend him different slates, okay? So to give you kind of a broad overview, I'll talk about one of these papers in detail, but kind of we've worked on this for a few years. So at some point in grad school, Duarte and I sat down and wrote down kind of a very simple model of economic choice in the context of recommender systems. And we were kind of motivated by this Nguyen et al. Paper, which presented kind of different empirical facts about consumption in a movie recommendation environment, which we used to kind of like, we wanted to write down a model that would allow us to kind of rationalize these things, right? So I won't go into the full details of the models, but the basic idea is you kind of have a user, they're long-lived, they deal with experience goods, right? If we think about books, movies, music, kind of users typically don't know how much they're going to like an item until they actually consume it, and they have some beliefs beforehand about how much they may like an item, right? The model had various bells and whistles, such as kind of spatial correlation of beliefs, but kind of the main value that a recommendation was providing them was basically giving them information about this match value, right? How much is it going to be the case that after consuming this good, I'm going to like it? And the kind of key empirical takeaway from our model was, this belief data can probably be very useful in understanding how people would choose under these different recommendation slates, okay? Then we partnered with people at MovieLens, which kind of this Nguyen paper was based off of, and we tried to understand this question of, okay, what is it that actually drives the effectiveness of a recommendation, right? And so I'll get into the details of this later in the talk, but we basically are going to run kind of within subjects design, thinking very carefully about how we can kind of measure the causal effect of a recommendation, and in particular kind of decomposing the effects of a recommendation into kind of information on product quality, right? How much I might like a movie that I know about already, but maybe I'm uncertain about its quality, versus kind of discovery, right? I don't know that, I don't know, Keanu Reeves was in John Wick, and I find out about that from the recommendation. And we're gonna kind of directly measure informational gains from this using belief data that we collect. And then the final paper, which is at Rexis this year, it just came out, was kind of like taking an approach to try to understand that can we actually move beyond this kind of contrived field experiment that we have to make this actually useful for kind of design, right? And so I'll have a QR code at the end. We have a procedure, and we open source a data set of these beliefs on MovieLens, which people can kind of use to play around with their own algorithms if they want to. Okay. Okay, and so I'm going to zoom in mainly on the field experiment and talk a little bit about the design thing afterwards. Now, and so again, if we're thinking about the sort of economic mechanisms behind how a recommendation can impact choice, again, the first is kind of consideration, right? You go on Netflix or you go on Spotify, and the number of goods on these platforms is really, really large. You probably don't know all of them, right? So one thing the recommendation can do is basically surface goods that you may not be aware of. Now, of course, when we're thinking about this experimentally, we can't control what consumers consider, and we can't directly observe this, but we can kind of force consideration through exposure, which we're going to directly look at, okay? The second is that recommendations kind of provide information in a few different ways, right? So you can go on Netflix, and the fact that Netflix recommended the product to you may make it so that you get an inference and say, hey, I didn't know, I wasn't sure if I liked this good before, but given that I trust Netflix's recommendations, I may update my beliefs in a positive manner, and I may be more sure of it. The second is that, again, by making these recommendations kind of prominent on the platform's homepage, they also reduce information acquisition costs, right? So it makes it easy for me to kind of click into a movie and find out more information about it. And again, this can be a source of information. For the purposes of this field experiment, we're not going to directly sort of decompose the direct and indirect inference. Okay. Now, the experiment hypotheses we have are pretty straightforward, right? So the first is that kind of both of these mechanisms play a role, right? So if we can kind of disentangle consideration and information, both exposure and this information channel should play a role in driving consumption. The second is that we're going to hypothesize kind of like what drives the additional effect of recommendation is going to be kind of this information chain from recommendations influence beliefs, which influence consumption, right? And so in particular, we're going to elicit measures of expected quality, uncertainty, and we can, goods with higher expected quality and lower uncertainty should be more likely to be consumed. The second is we can directly measure kind of belief updating, right? We can see that recommending a good should make consumers less certain about it and move their beliefs towards the platform's predicted value, okay? Now, when we're thinking about kind of disentangling these mechanisms and kind of figuring out the causal effect of recommendation, there's a few different challenges, right? So the first is that, to be clear, there's a subtlety here, which is we're interested in kind of measuring the effect of a recommendation, not a recommendation system per se, right? So there's a lot of papers in literature that, for instance, will put an algorithm and compare its performance to some kind of control algorithm, typically popularity, and that we view that as kind of measuring the effect of a particular algorithm on users' choices. Here we're interested in the question of kind of if you take as given that recommendations are going to be high quality, kind of how can I actually measure the causal effect of this recommendation? And the challenge is that recommendations by design are targeted towards individual preferences, right? You go on Netflix and they don't show you a random assortment of things, they show you something that's completely targeted towards you. And so kind of when we're thinking about an experiment here, we kind of need to think about ways to undo or kind of control for the selection, right? So we're going to be comparing movies that kind of are recommended to you to movies that would have been recommended to you. And the challenge is that on most online platforms, especially from external researchers, kind of the algorithm is typically unobservable. And so the solution we're going to have in our experiment is we're basically going to use kind of the intermediate outputs from the recommendation system on the platform that we work with that kind of gives us this intermediate idiosyncratic quality, right? So for each user, we have the measure of how much they are going to potentially like a given movie. And again, we're going to have our experiment kind of be within subjects to stratify goods based on this idiosyncratic quality, okay? Now, the second challenge, which is I think a little bit of a harder one, is that beliefs are unobservable and typically kind of awareness and this quality information are confounded, right? If I show you a recommendation, it's providing both of these things. And again, you could in principle kind of take a model-based approach here, but kind of if we can directly collect this data, then we view that as kind of being the most reliable way, right? And so what we're gonna do in our experiment is on this platform, the set of users that are enrolled in it are going to have a belief elicitation survey that they're going to see upon the platform's visit. Now, what is this going to do, right? So when we're going to kind of pick movies that are in this belief elicitation survey, we're going to be indirectly kind of exposing users to it, right? So but if I ask you, what do you think of The Matrix? If you had not heard of The Matrix before, this kind of makes you broadly aware of it. But we're going to kind of make it so that this belief elicitation survey kind of makes it a bit vague about if you just see the movie poster and sort of any information that you may have gone from the recommendation on the homepage is not going to be present here. And so we're going to have kind of another treatment arm, right? So we're going to have kind of, I'll go over, this will be summarized in the next slide, but basically we'll have a treatment arm where goods show up in recommendation, a treatment arm where goods only show up in these belief elicitations, and then a control arm, okay? And then we're going to be able to kind of elicit beliefs of movies that show up in these recommendations and in the, this belief arm to kind of measure information games directly. Okay. Now, to do this, we're going to run this on this recommendation platform called MovieLens. For those of you that work in recommender systems, you've probably worked with the public ratings data. So this is run from the University of Minnesota. It's been around since the 90s, had one of the earliest deployments of collaborative filtering recommendation systems online. And you can see here what the platform's homepage looks like. The top row is, the top row kind of gives user-specific recommendations, which again are based on users' consumption histories and are personalized. Now, the nice thing about MovieLens is, again, the ratings data has been around and publicly available since the 90s. And so this is, it's very common in the recommender system literature to kind of benchmark new algorithms on the MovieLens ratings data set, right? And so typically the training data here is considered high quality. This is going to be nice in the end when we kind of get to the beliefs data set because it's going to kind of pair it with this kind of relatively new data with kind of a traditional data set in this recommendation system literature. And the other nice thing is it's unbiased, right? It's non-commercial, it's free There's no streaming, no directing, so we kind of don't need to think about any platform incentives of kind of bias and recommendation. Okay. And so what is the experimental intervention, to be specific? So again, we're going to take, for the set of users that show up in our experiment, we can kind of fix at the beginning of the 6-month period their top 750 movies according to kind of the intermediate outputs from the recommendation system, right? And now what we're going to be able to do is we can kind of, basically pair each of these in groups of 3 and, randomize them into these 3 different groups, right? And so this is going to make it that by design, kind of like we're dealing with the selection problem here of kind of recommendations are high quality by directly making it so that goods that would have been recommended to you are now kind of in the control group in this elicitation only group, right? And so for the control group, these are never elicited beliefs about nor recommended. Again, users can technically kind of search for these movies, but they won't show up in that top picks. The elicitation only will elicit beliefs but not recommend. And then again, recommendations are going to be in both of these. Now, the subtle thing about the experimental design is we have to think about then kind of when a user shows up, which set of movies do we elicit beliefs about, and which set of movies do we show up in recommendation, right? So we kind of, every time period t, where again a time period t here is a user showing up on the platforms, we can kind of take the platform's predicted rating at the start of the study, add some mean zero calibrated noise, and use that to elicit beliefs and choose recommendations, right? So from the sort of top 8 recommendations, we're going to elicit quality about kind of the top 2 goods randomly selected from the top 8 in recommendation and elicitation only. And so what does this actually look like? And so you can see here, users would show up on this survey, and they basically would kind of give you a little bit more information than you would kind of on the typical rating. So they first mark whether or not they've seen the movie or not. If they've seen the movie, they give us the rating and an approximate watch date, which I won't get into the details, but we have to be a little bit careful in our intervention, kind of how we do the measurement of consumption, given that users don't watch movies on the platform. Now, if people click not seen, they are asked, this might be a little bit small, but it basically says, how do you think you would rate this movie on, again, the similar type of Likert scale that they use for the ratings, and then a 5-point Likert scale of kind of how sure they are of this rating, right? And they do this for these 10 different movies. And again, the kind of intuition here is we're basically going to be, when we're going to be doing our comparisons of information, we're going to be comparing movies that were recommended. So we're going to elicit beliefs before they show up in recommendations. They're going to see the movie on recommendations. And then the next time they come to the platform, we're going to ask them their beliefs about these same movies. And the persistence is going to allow us to detect changes in beliefs. We have the recommendation is going to be high quality, right? So it's going to use these platform's predicted rating plus calibrated noise to kind of pick the top 8. And again, we're also going to have a consumption survey. Now, what are the main things that we find? So I won't go into the full details here, but we have to be, again, a little bit careful about how we measure consumption. In particular, also, we want to be careful because not all these 750 movies kind of end up showing up in the recommendations. But the gist of it is we're going to use the belief data to kind of validate consumption measures, right? So we can kind of condition, for instance, in this last part here, kind of only on movies that at some point in the experimental period you kind of said you hadn't seen. The main gist is that recommendation seems to be the biggest consumption lift by far. The second hypothesis is kind of beliefs in consumption, and so here you can kind of see the consumption probability in the experiment plotted against kind of the expected quality, where again 5 is higher quality, 0.5 is lower quality. Similarly, you kind of see people that are more or less uncertain kind of have higher consumption probability. In the hopefully to be released updated version of the paper later this month, we do some instrumental variables thing to kind of show this is causal. And I'll skip through the belief updating part, but basically we find that hypothesis 3 is validated. People both move their beliefs closer to the platform's predicted quality and reduce their uncertainty. We also find that kind of consumers that are less experienced and so have higher uncertainty have larger gains. Okay, so that's great. Which seems to show that this belief data that we collect for this on this intervention seems to be reasonable. There are informational gains from recommendation. Now, what if we wanted to actually do this at scale, right? We wanted to say this seems very useful for understanding how users choose without recommendations. How can we actually collect this? The first is, it's infeasible to elicit via continual surveys. The experiment is a little bit heavy-handed. And so the main thing is we're going to sort of introduce this additional row on the homepage, which kind of has the same flavor of the survey. Now the challenge again is going to be how do you pick the set of goods here? Now one thing which is interesting but a challenge is that kind of people typically use rating and consumption data because it's naturally generated from usage on the platform, right? And so a challenge we have here is that we kind of have to use these belief data that are going to be at much smaller scale than ratings data. And so again, we're going to have to kind of, we kind of have a two-stage procedure where we kind of choose a subset of feasible items to elicit and which of these items to elicit, right? And again, I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but basically, we designed this data collection to solve the following problems, right? Where kind of the first is, again, you want to be able to characterize a set of prior beliefs over the space of goods, right? Similar to kind of that matrix completion exercise I showed you in the beginning, where I kind of was looking at people's ex post utilities of how much they'll like a movie after consumption. We also want to understand kind of like how can you characterize the set of prior beliefs over this similar space. But we're going to have to do this at a little bit smaller scale. And so again, we kind of elicit beliefs only for a subset of goods and rely here on kind of spatial correlation and beliefs that we identify and ensure that the subset is representative of the product space, think about how beliefs map to consumption, and then kind of identify how recommendations shift beliefs, right? And so we kind of have some time variation in this. We ran this for over a year on MovieLens. There's some deficiencies to the data set in terms of scale, but we think it's kind of a useful resource for the community, and we're going to keep working on this. Okay. And so to conclude, kind of a recommender system design is kind of both an algorithmic and a data collection problem, right? Most work in this space is kind of thought about, this algorithmic problem of how can we predict consumers' ex post utilities. But an understudied aspect of this is that kind of platforms have control over the type of data they collect. And so we kind of started for this research project kind of thinking that better understanding how users choose is kind of key for thinking about the design and impacts of these recommendation systems. We showed in this field experiment I talked briefly about that recommendations largely play kind of an informational role, and we explored kind of on one dimension of this data collection problem this auxiliary data on kind of consumer beliefs about what they think about items they haven't consumed already seems useful for kind of understanding how recommendations impact consumer choices and how they would make predictions without recommendations or under counterfactual slates. Again, I think this general problem of kind of thinking about the right type of data to collect here is kind of a little bit understudied, and so this was kind of us taking an economic perspective on things that we thought were useful, but again, I think there's a lot more work to be done in this space. Again, we designed a procedure to collect this data at scale for the community, and we open sourced it, and yeah, here's the QR code if you're interested in playing around with the data set at all. But yeah, that's all I have, so thanks everyone. Okay, any questions?
So it seems like your assumption is that highest match is better satisfaction, but wouldn't there be some situations in which you actually want uncertainty and you want to be surprised by how a movie may actually be very satisfactory?
Yes, that's a great point. So I think one of the motivations for kind of again moving away from just thinking about these measures of just taking that user by item matrix and picking the highest match value is kind of what's a more useful recommendation. And so this approach kind of does not posit that the best recommendation will necessarily be something that's kind of necessarily your highest match. We can kind of think of it as the thing that's most likely to kind of shift your beliefs towards something that ex post may be better. And again, the recommender system literature kind of has this notion of serendipity, where kind of a good recommendation is unexpected and useful. You can think of kind of the approach that we're looking at here as a little bit of an economic formalism of that, right? And again, one aspect of this problem that we don't delve as much into is for various reasons we kind of treat it as you make a one period decision to kind of pick what's the best thing for you given your beliefs, but users here are kind of solving a dynamic problem. So I think kind of extending work in that direction is a interesting line of work. Any other questions? Yeah.
So in the movie case, we assume that the platform's incentives and the user's incentives are aligned.
Yeah.
In like a Amazon type of case, like profitability, sponsored search, like other kinds of factors come in.
Yep.
And so, like, do you think these insights are like contingent on users thinking the platform is benevolent in the recommendations, and how would you adjust them if in those kinds of cases?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I mean, actually, at the same time Dort and I started this line of work, we actually had a paper that was on this self-preferencing thing. And so I think, at least for this set of work, we kind of agree that this problem is very important, but we kind of wanted to understand, even if you abstracted away from these strategic considerations, like which of these two mechanisms was more important? Can you think of this as being useful? I mean, one way to kind of view it would be that, like, if users are strategically reacting to the fact that I know that maybe Amazon over-recommends its own goods, kind of you'd think we're overestimating the role of information provision here, where kind of users are, going to be belief updating to the extent to which they're, they actually trust the algorithms from the platform. And so I think better understanding, on, more commercial platforms like even a Netflix or an Amazon, kind of to what extent do our results kind of generalize to there, or do consumers basically just assume that, like, well, I know Amazon is just going to be giving me crap, I actually don't update my beliefs at all. I think it's kind of an interesting direction for future work, and you can kind of use similar type of experimental design and tools, I think, that we do here. But definitely something at least I'm interested in, I think is interesting going forward. So, okay.
Also, maybe I'll stop moving my feet. All right. Last one of the panel, then we get to do open questions. So hello, everybody. I am really delighted to get the chance to talk to you today. This will be a little bit different, maybe. I have almost no data to share with all y'all. And I'm not sure if I have a good story about data, but I'll do my best. Short version is that I'm here on behalf of Civic Health Project, where we're working to actually put an intervention in the field to try and make a difference on, what we can do to address some of the problems of, quality of specifically political discussions in the United States. So, in fact, yeah, can you off or elsewhere or whatever? Thank you. So Civic Health, or maybe it's just me. Civic Health's goal is to improve and deal with the quality of our political conversations. Specifically, Civic Health is looking at the United States. In my past, I've looked at some of these things in other international settings as well. But to be very brief, we believe, certainly, and would agree with a couple of the other talks, that to some extent, basically, some content is explicitly a threat to democratic processes where such are even fairly well established, and tends to get in the way of people actually being able to talk across difference and have that expression of interaction across difference and actually have an effective public sphere. And furthermore, is somewhat erosive to our societal institutions that are trying to do those things. Briefly, this is a civic health project, and I want to call out that this is a bit of a team effort to put this thing together. Without going into it too much, I'll just say that, well, I won't go into it in much more detail. We'll talk about it later. I know we've already had a couple of talks about social media. Surprise, I'm doing it again. But when we were sort of thinking about what can we do about this problem, and what can we do about this problem now that the group of us were a civil society group, right? We didn't have necessarily control of the levers. What can we do? What is the root of the problem, and what can we do about it? So in terms of the root of the problem, I hate to call it one thing, but we know that all of these platforms select for engagement, which includes fear, it includes outrage. It isn't just fear and outrage. We know that. And it's also true, of course, that the social media algorithms may select for this because humans select for this, right? So I want to be really clear that I'm not entirely throwing my former employer and others under the bus here. I'm trying to say that humans are good human, right? And long before there was social media, there was, if it bleeds, it leads in terms of network news broadcasts and the like, right? So lots of things have tended to hit and get reactions from humans that then have some commercial purpose to a providing entity. And so this is not necessarily a new problem. what may be new is that in the past, with some types of media, you would be selecting and making a lot of editorial choice about what you wanted to present. Now we've thrown open the doors, everybody can do everything, and some people would like to solve this problem with content moderation, meaning people do whatever you want. We'll let people's natural inclinations of selection go where they will go. It'll be okay, though, because the worst of the worst we're able to find and step on fast enough, and that's a game of whack-a-mole that another talk would be just how badly we cannot do that. Unfortunately, I think one thing that is a little bit different in the social media world is the degree to which this can become reflexive, right? Like, people learn what works, and you know, when we talk about, you know, the outrage industrial complex, it's because it's kind of a thing, and if you go onto social media, different places, you will find people explicitly leaning into this, meaning you get even more conflict, demonization of others, intentional outrage bait, and that leads to social media being pretty awful, right? You get a lot of people, and if we may have had this idealized notion of there being norms of public and civic conversation, you'd be hard-pressed to find them in action. So what can we do? What can we do about it? What could actually do anything about this? Well, we'd like to fix the current platforms. I was in Meta for a few years, including during the US 2020 election or the 2020 elections. I was working for Instagram on information quality when the COVID vaccines were being introduced, and it was a little tough. You know, the business models are what they are, and I don't think that means that the companies don't care. And I don't think that means that improvements could not and are not continuously being made. But if you got a business and that business is making you about, you know, $1 trillion a year, I think you're naturally going to be a little bit conservative, right? And this is, you get a little averse to change. And I think that's true of social media companies. I think it's been true of every other company of these kinds of size in the history of time. You know, if you're the East India Company, you kind of liked the way things were working back in the mid-19th century. You didn't really want it to change, and you worked pretty hard to make sure it wasn't going to change. Of course, somebody eventually came along and disrupted you, so that's nice. So maybe we just need to throw everything overboard, get new platforms. I would very much like that. And there's some really cool stuff happening, but it doesn't change overnight. So what can we do now? Given that the platforms are going to be a little bit slow, and new platforms are going to take some time to turn things over. Well, been a lot of evidence on nudging and coaching to try and get people who exhibit problematic, harmful behaviors to change. I think those are very helpful. And so I endorse this just as I endorse the other two things that are on this list so far, but I think it's pretty clear that a lot of people are not going to change. So again, as an outsider, no longer have any controls over any big levers or any recommendations engines. And I know I can't either stomp on or convince politely to change everybody who's necessarily sharing harmful content. We want to say, what can we do to go directly to audiences? Like, what can we do without any of the control levers? And is there a way to directly influence audiences to improve social outcomes, and specifically in our case, to reduce the toxicity of political discussions? And the answer is, yeah. There's actually a fair amount of evidence that we didn't generate that in general audience norms can be shaped by talking to people about these sorts of things. You see this sometimes in smaller communities with community moderators, right? Like, hey, this is not what we want to do here. Sharing norms ahead of time as well as responding to norms can help shape the norms of that group and change subsequent behavior. And I think, I believe that most people are not actually necessarily, most of the time, especially toxic. And if you want to engage in politics, you'd like to do so in a way where you could actually hope to learn something as well as share something. And when you learn something, that's great, because your own utility goes up. And if you share something and you're not getting your head bit off, well, that's also rather pleasant. So what we're trying to do is set up an opportunity for there to be counter speakers or be a troll for good. Go out there and crusade. Now, question, of course, is how do you scale that? Scaling this is pretty difficult, right? Like, somebody will go out there and talk and, maybe turn somebody around, maybe exhibit a positive behavior. And so what we've actually built is a tool to support organized teams of counter speakers, AKA anti-troll farms. And so if you want to set up an anti-troll farm, what are the challenges you're going to have, and what can we do to help you to get through them? And really, I think there's two core challenges that you have if you want to be an anti-troll farm. One is knowing where to be. Who do you counterspeak to? Why do you counterspeak to that person? And then if you found an opportunity you want to get involved in, what do you say? Right? And there are a small number of carefully trained experts who are really great at counterspeaking already through years and decades of practice. Not as many of them as maybe we'd like, and getting them to spend all their time doing this is a little challenging. So the way that we look at to scale it is building a tool that uses LLMs to do both of those, to attack both those problems, and help humans to influence other humans to detoxify social media. So what are those two problems? Well, fortunately, LLMs are pretty good at, well, first of all, LLMs can't think. We all know that, right? What they do, what happens in there is not what happens in here. So we need to make a little care not to anthropomorphize them too much. But they're pretty amazing with language, right? Just pretty damn amazing these days, and getting more amazing every week. So they can really help us to find those opportunities to be effective through understanding or pseudo-understanding content that is posted, and doing a pretty good job of classifying that for things like toxicity, as well as other pieces of classification stuff, letting you know and start to predict where there's a good opportunity to be impactful, what might be viral, et cetera, things like that. And they can even supplement a text with things like context. So, is this a toxic tweet? Well, maybe you know right away, maybe you don't know. You're like, why is this person saying this, and why is this of concern? And you only learn what the concern is when you understand and somebody gives you a little bit of information about the coded language, or a little bit about a subculture that you weren't really aware of, and so on, right? And then, of course, how do you respond to it? And what kinds of things would both basically, by applying the strategies that have been known to be successful in counterspeech to the specifics of the content in question, and giving you some good suggestions for how to deal with it. So we're building that, starting on X because, well, it's X, with a nod to the Milli Center and some of the ongoing survey work that's being done around this. People have just the worst experiences on X. And of course, it's got a lot of political content. It's not the biggest, but it's got a lot of political content and a lot of cultural currency, right? People are still, wish they weren't, still announcing things that they believe to be of importance to the world on X an awful lot of the time. And so you take those two together and you find out that the bad experiences that people are having on X are mostly actually about politics. Since that's our field of interest, that's where we're going. And we have built a web app for counterspeaking on the former Twitter. We've been doing this now all through the summer. We've been in 25 weeks of development and user testing where we've had people going out and counterspeaking live on Twitter. And we've been using that to try and tune what kinds of suggestions we're giving, what places we're giving those suggestions in, how the tool can be effective in terms of providing user flow and monitoring and the like. And we're starting to, see, I made these graphs really small to make sure you can't read them, because we're only starting to understand what's actually working, like what's getting uptake and what's potentially going to change and generate the kind of engagement and norm shifts that we're after. So. It's intentional, they're small. I want to give, this is the scale that we're at right now, which is that we're doing about 1,000 interventions a month on Twitter, on generally high visibility accounts and threads. And that's what we have. I'll give a couple more data peaks at the end, but they're peaks. Before I do that, very quickly, this is what the app looks like and does. So the large language model, I will also make a call out to Jigsaw. We also use Jigsaw. We use our own LLM prompts and Jigsaw together to identify toxicity and opportunities to intervene. We present those opportunities to users. If the users are interested in one of them, they pop into it. They can see the tweet. They can see a little bit of information about toxicity, and the LLM also is willing to give some explanation of this toxicity to the user. So, and I will highlight, by the way, toxicity can mean about 1 million different things. For our use and our use case, we're trying to settle in on specifically these subcategories displayed above, dehumanization, strong negative sentiments around the out party. Your out party is them. So a lot of othering and advocacy or tolerance of partisan violence, and a couple of other things around societal cohesion. So we'll give you the post, we'll give you that. We'll also have some other things to give you background on the tweet and such if you need it. And then the LLM gives you suggestions, applying, like we said, some reasonably well-tested strategies to the tweets in question. So it's still a little small to read, but in essence, right, either taking a strategy like highlighting inconsistencies in the original argument, or bringing out empathy for a targeted party, or highlighting something that is specifically potentially not very accurate or doesn't follow, in the argument, right? And they're applied to the tweet in question. Then the human who's using this actually takes a look at those, edits, selects, entirely changes their mind what they want to say, and actually does the posting. So I do want to be clear here. We are not a bot out there stalking you on X and auto-posting responses. This is all done by humans. But the humans are scalable, right? Like, this is not your own feed where you like come across something or you don't, and it has 10,000 views or 5 views because it's your crazy uncle. And we've all got crazy uncle, crazy aunt, right? And then we also get you started instead of having a blank page of what do I say to this person that might actually have a positive outcome. I'll give you an example. This is maybe not actually the most toxic tweet in the world, but hey, somebody's on the one hand celebrating their crowd size, right, on one side of the political spectrum, and then they decide to get a little insulting about the impotent little group for demented grandpa. We can guess which side of, well, actually, on that date, it could have been either side, but yeah, anyway. It's a certain demented grandpa. And in any case, so this is an example of a post that is not exactly bringing people together. And so you would expect that you would get a comment section that tends to further that, and you do. There's a lot of us versus them. There's even sometimes some calls out towards violence, etc. There was one really nice thing that we had nothing to do with here, about at least they're tolerating each other and standing next to each other without having violence, which was nice. Got 13 views too. So this is what the it's not a comment section, but the thread tends to look like. So a couple of people saw this in our tool and put a couple of responses into that. Like the following, right? These are 2 examples. These were both actually generated by the LLM directly and posted in. And, unity isn't easy, but it's powerful when we focus on ideas over insults, or, we may differ, but let's actually talk to each other if we want to get forward. And it kind of worked. I wish I could tell you these are the 2 most popular replies to this, because they show up directly underneath the original post, but they show up directly underneath the original post in my feed. So all this tells you is X thinks that I want to see responses like this, not necessarily that everybody does. So it's actually quite challenging in the current data environment to figure out just where you rank. But we're not at the bottom all the time, which is nice. It's a start. So I promised a couple of quick data views. They're going to be very quick because about 6,000 caveats on this, given our N and some of the other things that are going on. So like I said, this was actually done when we only had about 3,000 so far. And actually the biggest thing that we've been working on is does responding work at all, right? Like if you respond to somebody on Twitter, does anybody ever hear you? And under what circumstances do they hear you? How can you influence whether they hear you, right? It's actually quite interesting to figure out. It's not about follower counts. It's not about your follower counts, and it's not about their follower counts. It's really about the recommendation algorithms it's selecting into the feed, and whether Twitter thinks that this is something that you'll bite on. Caveats. So first thing is those troll farmers. They know their business. You think about and you look at how low quality the stuff is that then somebody tells you got 25 million views on Facebook or this or that. And what isn't always said is that they actually had 1,000 posts and one of them got that many views. Because social media is a total hit-based business, we would get a number of views, but we get them on the extreme tail of this. 2% of our interventions generate 40% of the impressions. So you really are, basically, this is my favorite. I'm going to throw as many sports metaphors, bad metaphors, mixed metaphors that you guys can in about 30 seconds here. You got to take a lot of swings to see if you can fish in the right ponds, to maybe catch a whale, by which I mean really get quote tweeted by the right person who actually has influence sometimes, and or just get the engagement, the natural engagement to actually emerge, which, I mean, it's random, near as we can tell, near random. And then the last is the account and content quality do matter, but maybe less than you think. Like the differences that we see between somebody who brings 20,000 followers to the table and somebody who brings 20 followers to the table is about yay big. So it's really an interesting thing to figure out, and we're still working on figuring out what works, what gives us our better shots. We learned a few things, like you actually can draft on some of these threads and get some stuff, which is great. We learned a couple of things that surprise us, like if it is, maybe it's not that surprising, but if it's a big thread, getting in fast is essential. If it's a small thread, actually, it made no difference at all. You can come back, 12 hours later, and you'd think that that would have already had its whole thing. Not the case. You can revitalize it by responding to it. The last thing I said, the content quality matters, but not as you think. We're getting a good-sized data set of like what the LLMs are putting out there and what humans do when they decide to do something different than the LLM, whether they modify it or whether they just give their own reactions. And we find that broadly speaking, they're getting similar engagement levels. So the LLMs are doing just about as well as the humans. It's quite possible there's a selection bias in this and that the humans are selecting the LLM responses that suck the least. I think that may be the case. But they're certainly getting to the point of being useful. And then we're still working on quantifying some of what we're doing. And we're actually doing some off-platform experiments, as we call them, some straight lab survey experience, because we know we don't have nearly enough viewership yet to figure out on ourselves and validate the impact on viewers in our specific model. So I want to be really clear, we know we don't have that yet. So that's something we're going to start doing this year and continue doing next year. It's figuring out like how much we can actually move norms and what we have to do to do it. I'm done.
Can you say a word about how you would scale this, looking forward to have enough impact to be measurable?
Yeah.
Seems like a wonderful direction.
It's an interesting direction. It's maybe a little bit of a road less traveled. We're still figuring out if it's a wonderful direction. And so I mentioned we're putting in like just a couple hundred interventions a week, maybe 250 a week or so. And that comes out of people spending like 6 or 8 hours maybe, so less than 1 FTE. But it's not inconceivable. If you have a troll farm, you're not talking about one person. You're talking about like, let's get 20 people. Let's sit down and do this. Whether that's a volunteer, political organization, civic society sort of thing, or it's straight paid. When we get our numbers good enough, we would love to be able to justify scaling, but just having more people doing this kind of stuff. We're not there yet. I mean, our target is for the cost per impression on this custom sort of on-point response to be similar to what you'd get with a promoted tweet. Like, I'll pay some money and I'll get my static tweet out to more people. We'd like to be cost competitive, right? Because the effort you're putting in per hour at valuing your time ends up getting you those custom responses at a competitive price. We're off by an order of magnitude right now, so we're not there. So we haven't scaled, but that's one of the gates we got to get through to scale. After that, it's just money and time.
I think similar question. How has interest been, like, how has this been received by the platforms? Like, I'm thinking like Elon doesn't like content moderation, but community notes is cool because it's counter speech and philosophically seems aligned. That kind of approach seems aligned with what this tries to do. So I guess I was curious, like, have you gotten any positive feedback from platforms? Any talks about implementing it? I don't know. Just wanted to ask.
We haven't talked to Elon yet. These days, X is Elon, I think, in terms of how decisions get made. I think what I would say about it is I think it's highly defensible to say, I found some stuff in your platform and I want to speak to it, right? Especially, and we started with X in part because it is an open platform, right? There's no closed Facebook groups equivalents on on or strongly community moderated subreddits or anything. It's pretty much all open. If you put it out on X, it's public and people can respond to it. So we figure we're pretty much in the clear in terms of service violations, and we've certainly audited and looked that it seems both not forbidden and open. I will say, quote unquote, what are your rules on bots gets asked a lot, and that's a secondary reason why we make sure we have a human in the loop, is to make sure we're in the clear on some of that stuff. But a second reason why we have humans in the loop is that our outputs are just a lot better with a human yet. The LLMs are getting there, but I wouldn't unleash them on Twitter straight up yet either.
We'll just open it up to the whole panel for the next 5 minutes.
I guess my question's for Smitha. Since you happen to have worked at some of these platforms, including Twitter as well, I'm just curious what you think of Glenn's intervention, and do you think a platform might consider, I don't know, it's like in some ways platforms encourage the opposite. So, I mean, do you think there's a role for platforms to somehow encourage this kind of behavior in some way?
Yeah, you mean like just encourage it among, I don't know if it's on, regular people, not like a specific anti-troll farm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could.
Yeah.
I mean, you could imagine different ways. You could algorithmically sort of encourage it. You could use it as a measure. You could, I don't know. You could add credits. I don't know, but
Yeah, one thing, yeah, I think like the algorithmic ranking points that you brought up earlier about reducing reshares, I'm sure there's things in the objective that can make this kind of stuff more common. But yeah, another connection that came to mind during Glenn's talk was, now that I'm thinking about representativeness, is this is kind of a way of representing people in that thread who are not already present. And so if the platform tries to uplift representativeness, I think that's also kind of aligned with these goals. Yeah, I'd have to think more about it, but I think it's a really interesting direction.
yeah, I like what you mentioned about representativeness, because one thing I found when I was at platform was that the people who are moderate often are underrepresented, right? Like the people who are represented are the ones who are willing to engage, and the vast majority of us who might actually agree with what they are posting actually are not represented. So that's actually an interesting way to think about it.
I have two quick ones. So Smitha, one for you, which is, I'm curious what your reaction to Jenny's talk at the beginning of the day is in context of whether maybe there's a selection towards the kinds of things that would, on paper, seem less objectionable, but might actually be harmful in the kind of ranking you're talking about. And then Glenn, one for you, which is, if you did get to scale, are you concerned about a dynamic response question where you are inducing more people to try to get you to respond to them?
Yeah, so I think in our work, thinking about Jenny's talk, I kind of talked about conversational norms like civility and respect versus representation, but you could also think of, another ideal of deliberation is truthfulness, informativeness, factuality. So thinking about how does the kind of representation that we're advocating for trade off against factualness or truth is an interesting idea. So the results we have about if people's opinions kind of cluster into a few groups, representation isn't so costly would still hold. So I think in those settings, there's always some trade-off in every ideal. So you might need to show some stuff that gets kind of in that gray area, which I think also Jenny was bringing up in the trade-offs with freedom of speech. But I think that that's like an area where some of this counter speech, like the community notes or other things, could come into play. So the short answer is I think representativeness, there's always a trade-off with values, but I don't think it would come at a high cost in certain settings, and that I think there are other interventions that could be used if we bring out more representativeness, like counter speech or like community notes. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to use my response to kind of give another hot take. I already said I think content moderation is a kind of giant chase, right? Like we're chasing your tail, never going to work. The other thing I strongly believe, though, is, people talk about, first of all, I'll concede there's a ton of things to trade off in figuring out what you're recommending and what your and how you rank things. There's just a million things to trade off, right? And it's whether you get like these really deep analysis of a couple of them. But the one I wouldn't put in that category is freedom of speech. It gets put in that category a lot, like as if you're trading off truth or some other harm, against somebody's ability to speak something else. And if you choose less harmful content, or if you choose more truthful content that you choose to preference, then what you're actually saying is, does somebody have a freedom to be preferenced or to a certain level of distribution, not a freedom to speak, right? And I think everyone, in order to have a healthy public sphere, that you should be promoting content that has some opportunity to participate meaningfully and positively in a discussion towards truth or progress or health. And you should be promoting that over something that goes the other way. And that's my recommendation. I wish we would do more preferencing like that. But I guess the hot take is, what the hell does freedom of speech have in it, right? If you give an opinion that is not productive in the discussion and I ignore you, even if I'm ignoring you on behalf of several other people and that I'm not taking your word and then carrying it into this next room over here and broadcasting it to 50 million people, how did I violate your freedom of speech? Frankly, I didn't. And Section 230 codifies that platforms have their own freedom of expression to make those kinds of decisions, to say that they don't choose to carry every single thing that's said to an even number of other humans. They can pick which things they carry and retell to which humans and how many humans. And I think that's an important freedom on behalf of the platforms hold, at least in the U.S. Legally, and I hope we make more use of it, not less.
Okay, that's a great point to take a break. Thank you all.